My girlfriend always postponed everything, and this time she wanted to delay our discussion for a few days. I got fed up and simply didn't show up. Hey Reddit, my name is Dylan, and that Wednesday morning when my wife Chloe didn't kiss me goodbye, I should have known it was the beginning of the end. By then, her cold departures had become routine. But what struck me wasn't the absence of affection. It was the quality of silence that filled our kitchen. The air felt dense and suffocating, like stepping into a room full of sleeping strangers where even breathing felt intrusive. I watched Chloe move around our kitchen with the detached efficiency of someone who didn't really live there anymore. There was a time, not so long ago, when we used to bump hips playfully at the sink while brushing our teeth, laughing at our reflections in the bathroom mirror. Now, if our eyes accidentally met in the hallway, she would flinch away as if I were a harsh light she couldn't bear to look into. There was no shouting between us, no dramatic confrontations or thrown dishes. Instead, our relationship was dying through subtraction. I was being erased from her life in tiny, deliberate pencil strokes. Each day, another small intimacy disappeared. Each morning, another moment of connection was carefully avoided. I didn't say anything about it that morning, just sat there mechanically swirling cold coffee in a chipped mug while she buttered toast that I knew she wouldn't eat. She pulled on her coat with visible irritation, as if the fabric itself had personally offended her. Her purse landed on her shoulder with practiced efficiency, and her phone was already in her hand, thumb scrolling through messages before she'd even reached the door. She paused in the doorway for just a moment and without looking back at me said, "Let's talk tonight." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the echo of the closing door and the lingering scent of her perfume mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. Distance, maybe, or the smell of a life being lived elsewhere. When tonight finally came, she didn't. I found myself driving to the beach of all places, somewhere we hadn't visited since our kids were toddlers with sticky fingers and endless energy. I remembered how we used to take them there to throw breadcrumbs at aggressive seagulls and chase pelicans along the shoreline. Chloe would laugh and film everything on her phone, always zooming in on their delighted faces, capturing every moment of joy. She never minded being behind the camera back then, or at least I told myself she didn't mind, myself. But sitting there in my car, watching the overcast sky meet the restless ocean, I realized she had never really wanted me in the story she was filming. I was always the one behind the camera in our narrative, and now I understood that was exactly where she preferred me to be. Invisible, useful, but not really part of the picture she wanted to preserve. The beach was quiet that evening, shrouded in an overcast gloom that matched my mood perfectly. A couple of dedicated joggers passed by in their reflective gear, and a kid in an oversized hoodie was skateboarding in endless loops on the concrete pathway, the wheels creating a rhythmic sound against the pavement. I parked my car and just sat there, my fingers unconsciously tapping against the steering wheel in a nervous pattern I couldn't control. My stomach had clenched so tight that I could literally feel my pulse throbbing in my teeth, a sensation so intense it was almost nauseating. I didn't understand why I had driven to this particular place until I found myself checking her location on my phone. Yeah, I know how that sounds, and I'm not proud of it. But I had noticed something troubling 3 weeks earlier. She had stopped sharing her location with me entirely, just switched it off one day without explanation. When I asked her about it, she had given me that practiced response. Battery saving. But her eyes flickered to the left when she said it, the way they always did when she was lying to me. It was a tell I'd learned to recognize over years of marriage, though I'd never imagined I'd need to use it to catch her in deceptions this significant. So I had made a decision that still makes me feel sick to my stomach. I installed something on her phone, something that would let me see what she clearly didn't want me to know. That morning, while she thought I was still asleep upstairs, she wasn't at work like she'd told me. She wasn't showing the listing on Pine Street that she'd mentioned over coffee. Instead, she was parked in a cul-de-sac in the Riverside district, a neighborhood where I knew for certain she didn't have any professional listings. I sat with that information for what felt like hours, my mind racing through possibilities, imagining scenarios I desperately hoped weren't true, wishing with every fiber of my being that I was wrong about what this meant. But eventually, I couldn't stand the not knowing anymore. So I drove to that address, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel as I navigated through streets that felt foreign and ominous. It was the kind of pristine suburban neighborhood where people pressure wash their driveways twice a week and hang seasonal wreaths on their doors for every holiday. This wasn't her world, and it certainly wasn't ours. I parked 3 houses down from where her location had pinged, cracked my window slightly, turned off the radio, and settled in to wait for answers I wasn't sure I was ready to receive. At exactly 11:47 a.m., the front door of the house opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, with an athletic build and confident posture. His shirt was untucked in that casual, just-rolled-out-of-bed way, and he was wearing socks but no shoes. He stretched his arms above his head, like he owned the very sunshine itself, completely at ease in his own space. And then Chloe walked out behind him, pulling her hair back into a ponytail with movements that were fluid and relaxed in a way I hadn't seen from her in months. But what destroyed me wasn't just seeing her there. It was the smile on her face. Not the brittle, forced smile she had been giving me whenever I asked if she was okay. The one that never quite reached her eyes. This was her old smile. Her real smile. The one that used to be reserved for me during our early dating years. The man said something I couldn't hear, and she laughed in response. A genuine sound of delight that carried across the quiet street. Then she leaned into his chest and stayed there far longer than any casual acquaintance would. Her body language speaking of intimacy and comfort that made my chest feel like it was being crushed in a vice. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles cracked audibly in the silence of my car. That single moment told me everything I needed to know about where my marriage really stood. I had seen enough, more than enough. Without another word or sound, I started my car and drove home through streets that suddenly felt like they belonged to a different life entirely. I drove home in complete silence, feeling like a soldier who had just buried someone, but couldn't quite comprehend who had died yet. The familiar streets seemed foreign now, as if I was seeing them through different eyes. The eyes of a man whose life had just fundamentally shifted without warning. Every traffic light, every turn, every landmark on the route home felt like I was traveling through the remnants of a world that no longer made sense. When Chloe finally came home later that night, she carried with her the unmistakable scent of hotel soap. That generic, clean smell that's designed to be inoffensive and forgettable. I was sitting on the couch in our living room, probably looking like I'd been there for hours, which I had. She didn't even bother to ask where I'd been or what I'd done with my day. She just kicked off her shoes with the casual indifference of someone who had stopped caring about the basic courtesies of shared living and offered me a distracted hey as she set her purse down. I managed a nod in response, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. She stood there for a moment, shifting her weight from one foot to the other in that way people do when they're mentally somewhere else entirely. Then, as if remembering a script she'd rehearsed, she said, "Let's talk tonight." I looked up at her then, really looked at her face, searching for any sign of the woman I'd married, any hint of guilt or awareness of what she'd put me through. "You already said that," I replied, my voice coming out flatter than I'd intended. For just a split second, she froze. Genuinely froze, like someone who'd been caught in an inconsistency they couldn't easily explain away. But then, just as quickly, she shrugged with the kind of casual dismissal that suggested my words weren't worth the energy it would take to process them, and walked upstairs without another word. So here I am now, sitting in the same spot where I've spent most of the evening, and tonight has arrived just as she promised. But so has everything I wish I didn't know. The weight of that knowledge sits on my chest like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe normally. I know about the man in the Riverside district. I know about the way she smiled at him, the way she melted into his embrace like she belonged there. I know about the lies she's been telling me, the careful choreography of deception she's been performing every single day. The house around me feels different now, like the walls themselves have absorbed the truth and are holding it, waiting to see what I'll do with it. Every familiar object, the coffee table we picked out together, the throw pillows she insisted we needed, the family photos that line the mantle, seems to be mocking me with reminders of what I thought our life was versus what it actually is. The silence that once felt peaceful now feels loaded with secrets and unspoken truths. I keep replaying that moment outside his house, the image of her genuine happiness burned into my memory like a photograph I can't stop looking at. That smile she gave him wasn't something she'd lost. It was something she'd been saving, something she'd been giving to someone else while rationing out brittle imitations to me. The realization that she's been living a double life, maintaining this careful balance between the woman she is with me and the woman she becomes with him, makes me feel like I've been married to a stranger. Tonight has come, just like she said it would. But instead of the conversation she promised, I'm sitting here alone with the crushing certainty that our marriage has been over for longer than I realized, and I've been the only one still fighting for something that she walked away from months ago. I didn't sleep that night. Not even close. I lay there with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling while the sound of the bathroom fan hummed steadily from upstairs. She was in our bedroom, in our bed, probably doing exactly what I imagined. Texting him, scrolling through their private messages, rereading jokes they thought were so clever. Planning the next time she would disappear from our life, only to come home hours later reeking of someone else's cologne, carefully masked under that lemony body wash she'd started using recently. Every creak in the house sounded suspicious now. Every shadow that moved across the walls looked like proof of something I didn't want to believe. By 4 a.m., I found myself sitting in the garage in my car with the engine off, staring at my toolbox like it might somehow contain answers to questions I was afraid to ask out loud. I didn't cry, and I didn't yell or punch anything. But something fundamental inside me broke loose that night, like a critical bolt snapping free behind my ribs, leaving everything else slightly unstable and threatening to collapse. The silence in the house had changed completely. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a home at rest. It was loaded with tension and unspoken truths. I couldn't recognize it anymore, just like I couldn't recognize the hollow feeling that had settled into my chest. At exactly 7:30 a.m., I heard her footsteps coming down the stairs. She appeared in the kitchen with her bag already slung over one shoulder, her hair still damp from the shower, her eyelashes thick with the kind of careful makeup application that requires effort and intention. Chloe had the absolute nerve to smile at me when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table. "Morning," she said, with the casual cheerfulness of someone who hadn't spent the previous day in another man's bed. As if nothing in the world was wrong. As if she hadn't walked out of a stranger's house just 14 hours earlier while I watched from my car like some kind of private investigator in my own marriage. "You said we'd talk today," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt inside. She paused in her morning routine, and I could see the flash of annoyance cross her face. Not guilt, not embarrassment, just irritation, like I was some tedious meeting she'd forgotten to cancel from her calendar. "Oh, right," she sighed, setting her bag down with the exaggerated patience of someone being inconvenienced. "I'm kind of late, Dylan. Can we do this later? I'm slammed at work today." The casual dismissal in her voice, the way she talked about our marriage like it was a minor administrative task she could reschedule, made something cold and hard settle in my stomach. "You were free yesterday," I said simply. She blinked once, slowly, and I watched her face carefully. There was no guilt there, no fear of being caught, just calculation. I could practically see her mind working, figuring out how much I knew and how much she could still get away with. "Is this going to be a thing now?" "A thing?" she asked, her voice taking on that sharp edge I'd been hearing more and more lately. I stood up from the table, feeling suddenly like I needed the height advantage, like I needed to claim some physical space in this conversation. "You said you wanted to talk." I waited. My response was simple, factual, but it seemed to hit her like an accusation. "I had a long day," she snapped back, her mask slipping just enough to reveal the irritation underneath. "I don't need to be interrogated before I've even had breakfast." The way she said interrogated made it sound like I was being unreasonable for expecting basic honesty from my own wife. "You weren't at work," I said, my voice cutting through her defensive posturing like a knife. She blinked once, her face shifting into something more guarded, more alert. No guilt, no fear, just the careful attention of someone realizing they might need to adjust their strategy. "What are you talking about?" she asked. But there was something rehearsed about the question, like she'd been preparing for this moment and was buying herself time to think. "You weren't at the listing on Pine Street. You were in Riverside District." I watched her face carefully as I spoke, looking for any crack in the facade she'd been maintaining so expertly. There was a long pause where neither of us moved, the kitchen suddenly feeling smaller and more suffocating than it ever had before. "Chloe," I said quietly, my voice dropping to almost a whisper, "I saw you." The words hung in the air between us like a physical thing, heavy and undeniable. The silence that followed felt endless. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the distant sound of traffic outside, the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, all the mundane sounds of normal life continuing while our marriage collapsed in real time. Then, to my complete shock and disbelief, she laughed. Actually laughed, like I just told her the most ridiculous joke she'd ever heard. "You're spying on me," she said, and there was something almost amused in her voice, like she was impressed by my audacity rather than ashamed of her own behavior. "You said you were working," I replied, trying to keep my voice level and factual. The simple truth of it should have been enough, but somehow she was making me feel like I was the one who had done something wrong. She tilted her head at that familiar angle she always used during arguments when she knew she had some kind of advantage. That smug little expression that I'd seen 100 times before, but never in a context this devastating. "I was," she said, with the kind of confidence that made me question my own memory for a split second. "I watched you leave his house," I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. "I saw you walk out of that front door, pulling your hair into a ponytail, smiling like you just had the best morning of your life." The smile finally disappeared from her face, vanishing so completely it was like watching a mask fall away. She took a step back, her jaw tightening in a way that made her look like a completely different person. Harder, more calculating, more prepared for battle than I'd ever seen her. "You followed me," she said, and now there was real anger in her voice, but it was directed at me, not at herself or the situation we were in. "I checked your location after you turned it off," I corrected her. "After you lied about why you turned it off." "That's illegal," she shot back, as if legality was somehow the most important issue in this conversation. "That's marriage, Chloe," I said, and I meant it. "That's what people do when they're committed to each other. They share their lives. They're honest about where they are and what they're doing. They don't create elaborate deceptions and then act outraged when their spouse notices something's wrong." She scoffed at that, a sound of pure dismissal, and picked up her bag like she was preparing to leave. Like she could just walk away from this conversation the same way she'd been walking away from our marriage for months. "So what now?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're going to what? Yell? Throw something? Make this some dramatic movie moment where you get to be the wronged husband?" "I want the truth," I said simply. It was such a basic request, such a fundamental thing to ask for in a marriage, but somehow it felt like I was asking for the impossible. "The truth is," she snapped, her voice getting louder and more aggressive. "The truth is, I haven't been happy in years. You think cooking dinner and playing house fix is anything? You don't even see me anymore, Dylan. You see your idea of me, some version you've created in your head that makes you feel good about yourself." That hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me in a way I wasn't prepared for. "You could have told me," I managed to say, my voice coming out smaller than I wanted it to. "I did, over and over," she said, her words coming faster now, like she'd been storing up this speech for months. "You just didn't hear it because you didn't want to. You wanted everything to stay exactly the same, comfortable and predictable and safe." "No," I said, finding my voice again, feeling something hard and angry rising up from my chest. "You whispered complaints while texting another man in our bathroom. You checked out of this marriage completely and then blamed me for not noticing fast enough." She rolled her eyes at that, actually rolled her eyes like I was being dramatic, and stormed toward the door. "Where are you going?" I called after her. "To work," she said without turning around. "You're not going to talk about this? You're just going to walk away?" She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and turned back to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, detached, almost cruel. "I don't owe you a breakdown of my private life just because we share a mortgage," she said. Then she slammed the door so hard that a picture frame rattled on the wall. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that she wasn't sorry. Not even a little bit. She was already gone from this marriage. She just hadn't packed her things yet. The sound of that door slamming still rings in my ears like some kind of cruel punctuation mark on the end of a sentence I didn't write. She was gone, and the air in the house shifted immediately. Less tense somehow, but colder too. It was the kind of cold that doesn't come from temperature, but settles deep in your bones because something that once lived here has died, and you're the only one who notices the body. I didn't follow her, didn't call her phone, didn't send desperate text messages begging her to come back and explain. I just stood in the hallway for what felt like hours, staring at the groove in the wall where the door always knocked when she opened it too fast. That little groove had been there for 7 years, just a small scar in the drywall that we used to joke about fixing every time we passed it. She'd always say, "Leave it, it's our little dent," like it was something charming and endearing about our imperfect home. Now it felt like a monument to everything we'd never bothered to repair. I walked through the house slowly, almost like I was seeing it for the first time, really looking at everything with fresh eyes. The pictures on the wall showed our kids smiling in Halloween costumes from years past, their faces bright with the kind of joy that seems impossible to fake. There was the vase she had insisted on keeping despite it being cracked from our last move, claiming it had character. Her shoes were still by the door, those black heels she wore when she wanted to feel powerful. Probably the same pair she'd had on yesterday when she walked out of that stranger's house. I sat on the edge of the couch and stared at my phone, turning it over in my hands. I could call her, demand to know who he is, how long this had been going on, whether he knows she's married, whether he even cares. Instead, I found myself opening our shared cloud account, the one we'd set up years ago to automatically sync our photos so we'd never lose memories of the kids. There were photos there she'd probably forgotten were syncing to both our devices. One caught my eye immediately. It was dated 5 weeks ago, and it wasn't some steamy, incriminating thing. Chloe was smarter than that. It was a mirror selfie of her in a beige dress I didn't recognize, the price tag still hanging from the sleeve. The photo was taken in what was clearly a hotel bathroom, with those generic white tiles and chrome fixtures that all looked the same. Then I found another one, taken in the same bathroom just minutes later according to the timestamp. This time, there was a man's hand holding her waist from behind, his face carefully kept out of the frame. But Chloe's face was fully visible, her lips parted in a smile I hadn't seen since our honeymoon, a look of pure contentment and desire that made my chest feel like it was being crushed. I dropped the phone. Not because I was surprised, I wasn't, not anymore. I dropped it because some small part of me had been hoping, really hoping, that I was wrong about everything, that it was some massive coincidence, or maybe my own jealousy and paranoia making shadows out of nothing. But now I had it. Proof not just of betrayal, but of intimacy, of choice, of the kind of genuine happiness she'd been giving to someone else while rationing out brittle imitations to me. I cleaned up the shattered glass from the phone case slowly, methodically, like it was the most important task in the world. Then I sat back down and opened our shared calendar on my laptop, wanting to see the dates she'd claimed she had late showings. The nights when she came home humming under her breath or glassy-eyed or smelling like someone else's shampoo. They lined up perfectly. Every Thursday night for the last month and a half. Every single one marked as late showing, Riverside property. I closed the laptop and leaned back against the couch cushions, staring at the ceiling like it might give me permission to scream or break something or react like a normal person whose world had just imploded. I didn't, though. Instead, I picked up my phone and typed out a message. When you come home, I want the truth. All of it. I deserve at least that. She didn't respond. 4 hours later, I saw the location ping again on the app I'd installed. She was back at that cul-de-sac, back in his arms, probably laughing about the dramatic confrontation she'd just escaped. Still no message from her, no acknowledgement of what had happened between us. Just another silent betrayal in a house that used to be mine. She walked in like nothing had happened. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of the nuclear conversation we'd had that morning. Just the familiar sound of keys being tossed lazily into the bowl by the door, and that shuffle of her heels across the tile floor that I'd heard thousands of times before. Like this was just another ordinary Thursday in our ordinary life, instead of the day our marriage had finally been dragged into the light and exposed for what it really was. I stayed seated at the kitchen table, deliberately keeping the lights off except for the single overhead bulb that cast everything in harsh, unforgiving shadows. I wanted her to come to me this time. Wanted her to notice the silence and feel it pressing against her the way I'd been feeling it for weeks. But she didn't seem to notice anything different at all. "Chloe," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the darkness. She paused mid-step, and I watched her back stiffen for just half a second before she turned toward me with that same dead-eyed expression she'd perfected over the past few months. It was a look that said this conversation wasn't worth her time, but she'd entertain it for a moment out of some misguided sense of obligation. "I asked you for the truth," I reminded her, keeping my voice level and calm despite the storm raging in my chest. She exhaled sharply, like I just asked her to recount the details of some tedious meeting she'd rather forget. "You saw what you wanted to see," she said with the kind of dismissive tone you'd use on a child who'd misunderstood something obvious. "I saw your hand in his in a hotel bathroom," I replied, watching her face carefully for any crack in the facade. Now that got her attention. Her arms folded defensively across her chest, and her chin lifted in that defiant way that meant she was preparing for battle. "So you've been going through my stuff now," she said, her voice rising with indignation, as if violation of privacy was somehow a greater sin than adultery. "Don't turn this on me," I said firmly. I wasn't going to let her twist this situation into something where I was the villain for discovering what she'd been hiding. "No, I want to be clear," she said, her voice getting louder and more aggressive with each word. "You spy on me, Stalk me, dig through private things, and I'm the problem here? I'm your husband, I said simply, as if that basic fact should mean something in this conversation. She scoffed at that. Actually scoffed, like the very concept was ridiculous. Not lately, she shot back, and the speed with which she said it told me she'd been holding that particular weapon in her back pocket, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. That stung more than I expected it to, not because it was necessarily true, but because of how easily and quickly she'd said it, like she'd been rehearsing that line for weeks. I haven't touched you in weeks, Dylan, she added, driving the knife deeper. And you didn't even notice. I noticed, I said quietly, feeling something defensive rise up in my throat. I just didn't think I needed to compete for your attention in my own house. Her face shifted then, something cold and calculating flashing behind her eyes like she was reassessing her strategy. I didn't plan this, she said, and for the first time since she'd walked in, her voice carried something that might have been genuine emotion. It just happened. Who is he? I asked, cutting straight to the heart of what I needed to know. You don't know him, she replied evasively, like that somehow made it better. That's not what I asked. I kept my voice steady, refusing to let her deflect with non-answers. She hesitated for a moment, and I could see her weighing how much truth she was willing to give me. It's someone I work with, she finally admitted. It's not serious. The casual way she said those last 3 words made something snap inside me. Oh, so I should be relieved, I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You're just casually blowing up our family over something that's not serious? Her lips compressed into a thin, hard line. You don't understand what it's like, she said, her voice taking on a self-righteous tone that made me want to throw something. To feel wanted, desired, like someone actually sees you. I saw you, I snapped, finally letting some of my anger show. I saw everything. I saw you walk out of his house smiling like you just discovered fire. I saw the way you looked at him like he mattered more than I ever did. That's not fair, she protested, but there was no real conviction behind it. Fair? I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You think this is about fair? You walked out on this marriage before you ever left the house. You've been living a double life for months, and now you want to lecture me about fairness? There was a long pause after my words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in around us as the weight of everything unsaid finally found its voice. Then, so softly I almost missed it, she said something that hit harder than any slap could have. I think we both know this was dying for a long time. That sentence landed like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Maybe, somewhere deep down, part of me even agreed with her. Maybe I had noticed the slow erosion of intimacy, the gradual cooling of affection, the way we'd started moving around each other like polite strangers sharing the same space. But acknowledging that our marriage had problems was vastly different from what she had done about it. I stayed, I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. I showed up every single day. I kept believing we could still patch the roof even as the water came pouring in through every crack. I didn't go looking for someone else to make me feel better about the problems we were having. She looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in months, and I waited for something, an apology, an explanation, even just an acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused. But instead, she said nothing. Absolutely nothing. She just turned around and walked upstairs, her footsteps echoing through the house like a verdict being delivered. No, I'm sorry. No, we'll work this out. No, let me explain. Just the sound of her retreating, abandoning yet another conversation when it became too uncomfortable for her to handle. I didn't follow her this time. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed there in the dark kitchen, listening to the ceiling creak under her weight as she moved around in the bedroom that used to be ours. I found myself wondering if she was texting him right now, sharing the details of our fight, maybe even laughing about how dramatically I'd reacted to discovering their affair. The thought made my stomach churn, imagining her painting me as the unreasonable one, the husband who couldn't understand that sometimes these things just happen. I poured myself a drink I didn't really want and watched it sweat in my hand, the condensation making rings on the kitchen table that would probably stain the wood. The truth was finally out in the open, laid bare between us like something that had been hiding in the shadows for too long. But somehow, having it all exposed didn't make anything easier. If anything, it made everything more complicated, more painful, more real. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds. the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of old wood, the distant sound of traffic outside. But underneath it all was a new kind of silence. The silence of a marriage that had finally admitted it was over, even if we hadn't said the words out loud yet. I sat there for a long time, turning the glass in my hands, thinking about how we'd gotten to this point, about all the small compromises and unspoken resentments that had built up like sediment over the years, about the way she'd smiled at that man and how long it had been since she'd smiled at me like that, about the kids upstairs, sleeping peacefully while their parents' world fell apart one conversation at a time. The hardest part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the realization that she felt justified in it, that in her mind, our problems had given her permission to seek comfort elsewhere without ever giving me the chance to fix what was broken. She'd made unilateral decisions about our marriage and then acted surprised when I didn't appreciate being left out of the conversation entirely. I finished my drink in the darkness and listened to the silence upstairs. Eventually, even the ceiling stopped creaking, which meant she'd probably fallen asleep. Or maybe she was lying awake too, staring at her phone, planning her next move in this careful choreography of deception she'd been performing for months. Either way, I knew that tomorrow would bring more of the same, more lies, more deflection, more of her treating me like an inconvenience in her path toward whatever new life she was building with someone else. I didn't go to work the next day. I called in and told my boss I had a family emergency, which wasn't exactly a lie. It just wasn't the kind of emergency I wanted to explain between bites of his morning bagel during the Tuesday staff meeting. The truth was too raw, too complicated, too humiliating to reduce to the kind of casual explanation you give when someone asks why you're not at your desk. Chloe left early that morning, same as always, but something was different. There was no goodbye this time, not even the perfunctory, "have a good day" we'd been exchanging out of habit. Just the sound of her car backing out of the driveway and disappearing down the street. She didn't slam the door when she left. Instead, she pulled it shut softly, like the noise might wake whatever was still barely alive in this house. I stood by the window and watched her leave. Watched her signal left at the end of our block. The same direction she always took when she claimed to be going to her office. But I knew she wasn't going to her office. By now, I understood the pattern, the careful choreography of her deceptions. I waited exactly 6 minutes, then got in my car and followed the route I'd memorized. She'd turned off her location sharing again, but I didn't need it anymore. By now, I knew exactly where she was going. It took 22 minutes to get there. 22 quiet, trembling minutes driving down streets we used to travel together. We passed the grocery store where we used to have lighthearted arguments about what brand of cereal to buy. Past the park where she'd kissed me in the rain 7 years ago, like we were the only two people in the entire world. Now she was someone I had to trail like a private investigator following a stranger. She pulled into the same cul-de-sac, parked in front of the same house with the same confidence she'd shown yesterday. This time, she didn't even bother checking her mirrors or looking around nervously. She just got out of her car and walked up to that front door with a kind of ease I hadn't seen in her in months. Like this was her real life, and everything we'd built together had just been a long, inconvenient detour. I didn't park this time, didn't even slow down as I drove past, but I saw everything I needed to see. The porch light was still on even though it was broad daylight. The guy, tall, athletic build, maybe late 30s, opened the door before she even had a chance to knock. She laughed as she walked inside, that same genuine laugh I'd heard yesterday, and he touched her back in a way that spoke of familiarity and intimacy. Then the door closed behind them, sealing off their private world like I didn't exist, like I hadn't given 11 years of my life, 2 children, and every ounce of energy I had trying to hold together, something she was so eager to walk away from. I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I ended up parking in an empty strip mall lot, just sitting there in my car for what felt like hours, staring at nothing. My phone sat in my lap with the screen dark, and I thought about calling someone. My brother, my best friend. Hell, even my father who'd never been great with emotional conversations. But how do you say those words out loud? My wife is cheating on me. No matter how you phrase it, it sounds pathetic. Like you missed something obvious that everyone else saw coming. Like you somehow weren't enough to keep your own spouse interested. Instead, I opened the Notes app on my phone and started writing down everything I could remember. Every lie she'd told, every night she'd come home late with some excuse about work, every time she'd claimed to be showing a property that didn't exist. I wrote it all down like I was building a case file, documenting evidence for some future trial where I'd need to prove what had really happened to our marriage. Then I deleted it all. I didn't need a written record of her betrayals. I was living them every day. When I finally drove home, the house felt dark and still, like it had been holding its breath, waiting for me to return. I sat on the floor of the hallway and stared at the front door for hours, waiting for her to come back, waiting for the next chapter of this nightmare to unfold. She didn't come home that night. No phone call, no text message, no excuse or explanation. Just silence. And somehow that silence was louder and more damning than anything she could have said. It was the silence of someone who had stopped pretending to care about the collateral damage of her choices. That next morning, I wasn't numb anymore. I was furious. There's a specific kind of anger that settles into your body when someone takes everything you've built together, systematically rips it apart in silence, and then has the absolute audacity to pretend that you're the problem. It's the kind of fury that doesn't make you scream or throw things. Instead, it tightens every muscle in your body and sits behind your eyes like a migraine with teeth. She came home around 9:18 a.m., and I watched her from the kitchen window as she walked up our driveway. No makeup, hair pulled back in a loose braid, wearing clothes I didn't recognize. She looked exactly like someone who had just stepped out of a bed that wasn't ours, and she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. When she walked through the front door, she actually flinched when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table with a plate of untouched pancakes in front of me. Like she'd genuinely forgotten I existed. Forgotten that this was still my house too. "Dylan," she said, and there was something almost surprised in her voice, like encountering me here was an unexpected inconvenience in her day. "You didn't come home last night," I stated simply, keeping my voice level despite the storm raging inside my chest. She dropped her keys in the bowl by the door with deliberate casualness, not even bothering to look at me when she responded. "I told you I needed space." "No, Chloe," I said, standing up from the table now, feeling like I needed the physical advantage of height for this conversation. "You disappeared. There's a difference between needing space and vanishing for an entire night without a word." "I'm not doing this again," she said, with the weary tone of someone who is tired of being inconvenienced by basic accountability. "Yes," I said, my voice getting stronger with each word. "We are doing this. You don't get to come and go like this is some hotel you're tired of staying at. This is a home. This is my home, and you—" My voice cracked slightly, but I pushed through it. "You're not a guest here. You're supposed to be my wife." That finally made her stop moving. She looked at me like I was something broken that she'd found on the side of the road. Not pitiful exactly, just inconvenient and slightly puzzling. "I didn't ask for this to get ugly," she muttered, like the ugliness was something I was imposing on an otherwise clean situation. "No," I said, feeling something cold and hard settle in my stomach. "You just asked for it to be quiet, easy, and secret. You wanted to dismantle our marriage without any of the messy complications that come with honesty." She walked over to the couch and sat down heavily, kicking off her shoes like she was about to settle in for a long conversation. Like we were going to sweep this affair under the rug and pretend it hadn't stained every inch of the carpet underneath. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. "What's his name?" I asked directly. She didn't answer, just stared at me with that blank expression that had become her default response to any question she didn't want to deal with. "I already know where he lives," I continued, my voice getting steadier as I spoke. "I already know you've been seeing him for weeks. I've got photos, dates, a complete timeline. I know it all, Chloe." Still nothing from her, just that infuriating silence that she wielded like a weapon. "Is he married?" I pressed. "No," she said finally, the single word coming out flat and emotionless. "Divorced." "Kids?" "2 teenagers." Another fact delivered without any apparent awareness of how devastating this information was to hear. I nodded, filing away each detail like I was building a case. Maybe if I pulled hard enough at these threads, the entire fabric of her deception would come unraveled. "Does he know about me?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I could see her calculating how much truth she was willing to give me. "He knows I'm married." "But does he know you're still living with your husband?" I asked, my voice getting sharper. "That we have children together? That every time you sneak out of here to be with him, you crawl back into our life the next morning, pretending to be a mother and a wife?" She stood up fast, her face flushing with anger. "You think you're perfect," she snapped, her voice rising for the first time since she'd walked in. "You think I just fell into this because I'm evil or something. You stopped trying years ago, Dylan. You became a shell, a safe, boring shell of a person, and I tried to fix things, but all you ever did was coast." "Coast?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitter disbelief. I carried you. I carried us. I was the one working to pay for this house, planning our vacations, remembering our anniversary, making sure the kids had everything they needed. No, she said, her voice sharp and cutting now. You controlled us. Every decision, every plan, every damn calendar entry had to go through you. You planned my life so much that I forgot how to live it. So that's why you found someone else? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Because he doesn't plan? Because he lets you pretend like none of this ever happened? Because with him, you can play house without any of the actual responsibilities? She didn't reply to that. Instead, she just turned around and walked upstairs without another word, leaving me standing in the middle of that empty kitchen with the smell of cold pancakes and betrayal hanging in the air around me. I didn't stop her from walking upstairs. There was no point anymore. Instead, I stayed on the main floor, pacing circles around the living room like a man walking the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way beneath him. Every creak in the ceiling above was a reminder that she was still up there, still living her life like I was the problem, like she was somehow the victim in this entire situation. It was almost dark when I finally walked past our bedroom door and discovered she had locked it. Locked it like I was a stranger, like I was some kind of threat to her safety, like I was someone who didn't belong in his own marriage. I didn't knock or demand entry. Instead, I went back downstairs and sat on the couch with the television off, holding the remote in my hands like it might somehow anchor me to this moment, to this reality I was still struggling to accept. Around 8:45, the front door opened and the kids came bursting through, back from their planned sleepover at my sister's place. Thank God for that timing. I couldn't imagine having to navigate this minefield of tension and hostility with them in the house, witnessing the slow-motion destruction of their parents' marriage. Chloe didn't even come downstairs to greet them, didn't emerge from her locked sanctuary to ask about their night or give them the hugs they'd been expecting. I brushed my daughter's hair in the living room, listening to her animated chatter about some movie they'd watched, her little legs swinging off the side of the couch as she described every plot detail with the kind of enthusiasm only children can manage. My son showed me a drawing he'd made of our cat, proudly pointing out each carefully colored whisker and explaining why he'd chosen purple for the background. They were completely oblivious to the war that was happening in the same house where they slept, ate breakfast, and felt safe. I lied through my teeth when they asked where their mother was, telling them she was just tired and resting upstairs. The words felt like ash in my mouth. But what was the alternative? How do you explain to a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old that their mother is systematically destroying their family for someone she claims doesn't even matter that much? How do you protect their innocence while your own world is crumbling around you? I got them ready for bed with extra care that night, taking my time with teeth brushing and story reading, kissing their foreheads and lingering in their rooms long after they'd fallen asleep. I found myself staring at their peaceful faces, wondering how I was going to tell them what was coming, wondering if I should even try to shield them from the inevitable explosion when this whole charade finally collapsed under the weight of Chloe's lies. Downstairs, the silence returned with a vengeance. At exactly 11:23 p.m., I heard the front door open again. Chloe walked in like she'd never been gone, like the past few hours were just a brief intermission in her regular programming. She was dressed differently than she had been that morning. Makeup reapplied with careful precision, hair styled in a way that suggested effort and intention. Her phone was still lit up in her hand, with a message she didn't even bother to hide from me. When she saw me sitting on the couch, she gave me that same blank, careless look I'd been receiving for weeks now, like I was a teacher calling on her for an answer to a question she didn't care enough to think about. "Where were you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Out," she replied, with the kind of dismissive brevity that was clearly meant to end the conversation before it started. "Who was watching the kids?" I pressed, feeling a surge of anger at her casual disregard for even the most basic parental responsibilities. "I knew you were here," she said with a shrug, like that somehow made it acceptable. "And if you hadn't been, I would have figured something out." The casual way she said it, like our children's welfare was just another problem she could solve with minimal effort when convenient, made my blood boil. I shook my head, genuinely stunned by her complete lack of awareness or concern. "Do you even care anymore? About any of this? About them?" She dropped her bag on the counter and walked straight past me, deliberately brushing her shoulder against mine, like I was nothing more than a coat rack standing in her path. "I'm tired, Dylan," she said without looking back. I followed her into the kitchen, unwilling to let her escape this conversation the way she'd been escaping everything else. No, you're not tired, I said, my voice carrying more conviction than I'd felt in weeks. You're finished. Just say it. Just admit what we both already know. She poured herself a glass of water with deliberate slowness, took a long, casual sip, and then looked at me with the kind of detached calm that made my skin crawl. I don't want to do this anymore, she said finally, her voice carrying no more emotion than if she was declining a second helping of dinner. She said it like she was quitting a book she'd gotten bored with halfway through, like our 11-year marriage was just another hobby she'd lost interest in. Not the fighting, not the pretending, not this whole broken-down act where we both hate being here. The casual way she said those words, like our marriage was just some tedious performance she was tired of giving, made something inside me turn to ice. So you've been cheating on me to what? I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Transition smoothly into your next relationship? Make sure you had somewhere soft to land before you bothered to tell me you were jumping? She didn't even blink at the accusation. Her face remained completely neutral, like we were discussing weekend plans instead of the systematic destruction of our family. Do you love him? I asked, needing to understand the depth of this betrayal, needing to know if she'd thrown away everything we'd built for something real or just for the thrill of escape. No, she said without hesitation, her voice carrying no more emotion than if I'd asked her about the weather. Not really. That answer hit me harder than if she'd said yes. At least love would have been something I could understand, something that might have made sense of this devastation. But you'll leave me for him, I said, the words coming out as more of a statement than a question. She shrugged, actually shrugged, like the decision to abandon her family was no more significant than choosing what to have for lunch. It's not about him, she said, with that same infuriating calm. It's about not being with you. I went completely still. Something inside me shut off like a light switch being flipped, leaving everything cold and dark. I wasn't just the person being cheated on. I was the inconvenience she needed to step over to get to whatever life she thought she deserved. The problem wasn't that she'd found someone better. The problem was that she couldn't stand being married to me anymore, and literally anyone else would do as an alternative. She set her glass down on the counter with a soft clink and walked toward the stairs without saying another word. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of the bomb she'd just detonated in our kitchen. I stood there with my palms flat against the kitchen island, breathing like someone who was just learning how to do it properly, while she disappeared upstairs to whatever sanctuary she'd created for herself in our bedroom. She was done with this marriage, done with me, done with the life we'd built together. She just hadn't packed her belongings yet. By the time Saturday rolled around, the quiet between us had gone nuclear. We didn't speak to each other, didn't make eye contact, didn't acknowledge each other's existence in any meaningful way. She moved through the house like a ghost with keys, still here, still using the refrigerator and doing her makeup in the mirror we'd bought together, but not present, not with me, not part of any shared reality. She hadn't said anything about divorce proceedings, hadn't mentioned custody arrangements, hadn't brought up any of the practical discussions that normal people have when their marriage is ending. Because in her mind, it already was over. She had made her choice weeks or maybe even months ago, and I was just the background character waiting for my scene to end, waiting for her to get around to making her exit official. That Saturday morning, I woke up to discover she was already gone. She'd left earlier than usual, earlier than any legitimate work appointment would require. I checked the calendar on our refrigerator out of habit. Nothing scheduled, no client names, no appointments listed. But I didn't need her fake schedule anymore. By now, I had my own agenda. I waited until the kids were safely at my mother's house, telling her I needed to take care of some things around the house. That wasn't exactly a lie, though the things I needed to take care of had nothing to do with home maintenance and everything to do with the maintenance of my sanity. By noon, I was parked outside his place again, staring at the same SUV in the driveway, listening to the same wind chimes jingling cheerfully on his porch like this whole situation was innocent and peaceful. I wasn't planning anything reckless or dramatic. I wasn't going to kick down his door or throw punches or create some scene that would end up on the evening news. I just needed to see them together again. Needed to understand what was so magnetic about this guy that Chloe was willing to throw away a decade of marriage for him. I needed to witness firsthand what I was losing to. At exactly 12:41 p.m., his front door opened and he stepped out first. He was wearing a tan jacket and sunglasses, moving with the easy confidence of someone who probably jogged every morning and complimented baristas with just a little too much charm. Chloe came out next and she was laughing at something he'd said. Not just a polite chuckle, but her real laugh. The genuine one I hadn't heard in years. I snapped a photo with my phone, though I'm not sure why. Maybe I needed proof for myself. Evidence that this was really happening and not just some elaborate nightmare my subconscious had created. They walked to his car together, and she slid into the passenger seat with the kind of practiced ease that comes from having done something dozens of times before. I don't know what broke in me more. The fact that she was cheating, or how comfortable and natural she looked doing it. This wasn't some desperate affair born out of loneliness or confusion. This was a relationship, complete with routines and inside jokes, and the kind of easy intimacy that takes time to develop. She'd been building this other life while I was still trying to repair the one we supposedly shared. I watched them drive off together, their car disappearing around the corner like they were heading off on some weekend adventure. I didn't follow them this time. I didn't need to. I had what I'd come for: certainty. And with that certainty came a sick kind of clarity that settled over me like cold water. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This wasn't some mistake she'd stumbled into out of loneliness or confusion. This was a campaign. Quiet, methodical, and complete. She had checked out of our marriage a long time ago and had simply stayed long enough to make sure her exit strategy had soft lighting and a comfortable landing pad. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd been fighting for a marriage that she'd already buried, watering a garden where she'd already salted the earth. I drove home with that knowledge burning in my chest and started doing what I should have done weeks ago. I began collecting her things, not in a rage, not as some symbolic performance of righteous anger, but because it was simply time. I pulled a suitcase out of the hall closet, the same one we'd used for our honeymoon 11 years ago, and placed it deliberately on our bed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I filled it methodically with clothes she wouldn't miss immediately, items from the back of her closet that she hadn't touched in months. There was a drawer full of jewelry she used to wear before she stopped caring about my opinion, perfume bottles that still sat half full and neglected, accessories from a time when she dressed for me instead of for someone else. I packed it all neatly, folding each item with the same care I'd once used when helping her pack for business trips. Then I walked to my home office and pulled out a manila folder from the filing cabinet. I started printing everything: dates, times, screenshots of her location data, photos from our shared cloud account that she'd forgotten were syncing to both our devices, her messages, the hotel receipts I'd found, even that picture of her in the beige dress with the price tag still attached. I laid it all out on the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle, creating an undeniable timeline of deception. I wasn't giving her the satisfaction of a dramatic fight or an emotional breakdown she could later use to justify her actions. Instead, I was giving her facts, cold, documented, irrefutable evidence of exactly what she'd done and when she'd done it. Let her lie to herself about how this had all unfolded. Let her twist the narrative for her friends and family, painting me as the controlling husband who couldn't understand that sometimes these things just happen. But the evidence would be here, waiting for her, undeniable and comprehensive. She could walk out of this marriage if that's what she wanted, but she'd never be able to walk out thinking I was blind to what she'd actually done. When she came home around 6:15 that evening, I could feel the air in the house shift immediately. She saw the suitcase first, sitting there on the bed like a statement she couldn't ignore. Then she noticed the manila folder on the kitchen table, thick with documentation, and laid out like evidence in a courtroom. Her face drained of color as she took in the scene, and for the first time in weeks, she looked genuinely rattled. She looked at me standing there in the kitchen, and I could see her trying to process what she was seeing, trying to figure out how much I knew, and how I'd found out. "I guess this is it then," she said finally, her voice smaller than it had been in any of our recent conversations. "No," I said, my voice steady and calm in a way that surprised even me. "This was it a long time ago. I'm just finally catching up to where you've been for months." She sat down heavily in the chair I'd pulled out for her, the same chair where she used to help our kids with their homework, where she used to sit with her morning coffee and tell me about her plans for the day back when those plans actually included me. I didn't sit down. I needed the advantage of height for this conversation, needed to maintain some sense of control in a situation where I'd felt powerless for so long. "Go ahead," I said, gesturing toward the folder. "Look at it all. See what your careful planning looks like when it's laid out in chronological order." She opened the folder slowly, like she was afraid of what she might find inside, and I watched her face as she flipped through page after page of her own deception. Every screenshot, every timestamp, every lie she'd told wrapped up in a neat little timeline that told the story of how she'd systematically dismantled our marriage while I was still trying to save it. For the first time in weeks, she had absolutely nothing to say. Nothing at all. She sat there flipping through the folder with mechanical precision, like she was reviewing someone else's life instead of her own. But it wasn't someone else's. It was hers. Every lie she'd told wrapped up in a neat little timeline. Every deception documented with timestamps and screenshots. The days, hours, and exact locations where she'd chosen to build her new life while letting ours crumble. Even the name of the hotel where she'd claimed the Wi-Fi was terrible. I had the receipts for that too, literally. Still, she didn't say a word. She just sat at the kitchen table in the same spot where she used to eat breakfast with our children, methodically turning pages like she was reading a grocery receipt for items she didn't remember buying. I watched her eyes move across each page with that same detached expression she'd perfected over the past few months, like nothing could really touch her anymore. Finally, she spoke, and her words surprised me more than any breakdown or emotional outburst could have. "So, this is what you've been doing," she said, and there was something almost like admiration in her voice, like she was impressed by the thoroughness of my investigation. I stared at her, not feeling anger anymore, just a kind of profound disbelief at her complete inability to grasp the gravity of what she'd done. "This is what you made me do," I said simply. "This is what happens when someone you trust starts living a double life. You force the people who love you to become detectives in their own marriage." She smiled then, faintly, but it was there. Almost like she was proud of what she'd accomplished, like pulling off this elaborate deception for months had been some kind of personal achievement. "I didn't think you had it in you," she said. And I couldn't tell if she was talking about the surveillance or finally standing up to her. "I didn't," I replied honestly. "But you made sure I learned how. You turned our marriage into something so dishonest that I had to become someone I never wanted to be just to understand what was happening in my own life." She closed the folder with deliberate care and pushed it away from her across the table, like it was beneath her consideration now that she'd seen its contents. "You really want to drag this through court?" she asked, her voice taking on a practical tone that made my skin crawl. "Make this whole thing public and messy?" "I'm not dragging anything anywhere," I said, feeling my voice get steadier as I spoke. "You've already buried this marriage, Chloe. I'm just making sure it's marked properly so everyone knows where the body is." "Dylan," she said, and suddenly her voice had shifted to that softer register she used when she wanted something, when she was trying to manipulate a situation back in her favor. "We have kids together. We need to be civil about this. We need to think about what's best for them." I almost laughed at the audacity of it. "You want to talk about being civil?" I asked. "After what you've done? After months of lying to my face and sneaking around behind my back? Now you want civility?" "I made a mistake," she said, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, she sounded like she might actually be trying to apologize. But it was too little, far too late, and we both knew it. "No," I said firmly. "You made a choice. Over and over and over again. Every time you lied about where you were going, every time you came home smelling like someone else, every time you looked me in the eye and pretended everything was normal, those were all choices." She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms defensively. "I was unhappy," she said, like that simple statement should explain away months of systematic deception. "And instead of working through it with me, instead of having honest conversations about what was wrong, you found someone to fill the space while I was still standing in it," I interrupted. "You decided our problems gave you permission to start a whole new relationship without ever giving me the chance to fix what was broken between us." She said nothing to that, just sat there looking at me with that calculating expression I'd come to recognize so well. I walked around the table and opened the drawer where I'd been keeping the divorce papers I'd started drafting with a lawyer friend months ago, long before I'd ever seen her walk out of that other man's house. Some part of me had known this was coming, had felt the foundation of our marriage shifting beneath my feet, even when I couldn't articulate why. I slid the papers across the table to her, the same way she'd slid away that folder full of evidence just minutes before. "You don't even have to read them if you don't want to," I said. "I'm giving you exactly what you want. You're free to go build whatever life you think you deserve with whoever you want to build it with." She looked down at the papers but didn't touch them, like they might contaminate her somehow. "And the kids?" she asked. And for the first time since this conversation started, there was something that might have been genuine concern in her voice. "We'll figure that out," I said. "But not today. Today is about ending this charade we've been living. Today is about finally admitting that you checked out of this family a long time ago. She stood up slowly from the chair, her movements deliberate and careful, like she was trying not to disturb something fragile that might shatter if jostled. She walked past me without saying a word, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of cologne that wasn't mine clinging to her clothes, mixed with that hotel soap scent that had become her signature over the past few weeks. She didn't look back at me as she moved through the kitchen, but I saw her eyes sweep over the room one final time, taking in the walls we'd painted together, the table where we'd shared thousands of meals, the refrigerator covered with our children's artwork and family photos. For just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across her face that might have been regret or sadness, but it passed so quickly, I couldn't be sure it had been there at all. She picked up the suitcase I'd packed for her, testing its weight in her hand like she was surprised by how little of her life I'd managed to fit inside it. Then she turned and looked back at me one last time, but not really at me. More like she was looking at the house itself, at the memories embedded in these rooms, at the life she was about to walk away from forever. Then she left. The door didn't slam this time. It clicked shut with a soft, almost polite finality that somehow felt worse than any dramatic exit could have. Just like that, she was out of the house, out of our marriage, out of the daily fabric of our children's lives. But the silence she left behind, that lingered like smoke in every room. That night, the house felt cavernous in a way I'd never experienced before. Not quiet, hollow, like every sound echoed just a little too long, like the rooms had been emptied of more than just her physical presence. I walked through them slowly, not like a homeowner, not like a husband, but like a visitor in a place that used to mean something important, but had somehow lost its significance. The suitcase was gone, obviously, but her scent still clung to the bathroom towels like a ghost refusing to leave. The makeup she used to clutter the sink with had vanished, leaving behind clean countertops that felt sterile and unfamiliar. Her side of the bed was suddenly too flat, too clean, too untouched. A stark reminder of how long it had been since we'd shared that space as anything more than reluctant roommates. I didn't lie down on that bed. I couldn't. The thought of stretching out across that expanse of empty space felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. Instead, I grabbed a blanket from the hall closet and settled onto the couch downstairs. Not because I had to, but because that bed didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a museum exhibit from a marriage that had ended months ago, preserved exactly as it was the last time we'd both pretended everything was normal. I didn't cry that night, didn't scream, didn't throw anything or punch walls or give in to any of the dramatic impulses you see in movies about divorce. What I felt was something both worse and better than rage. I felt relief. Deep, profound, cleansing relief. Because the waiting was finally over. The worst thing that could happen to our marriage had already happened, and somehow I'd survived it. It had taken her actually leaving to show me that I'd been living through the aftermath for months without even realizing it. I woke up to silence again the next morning, but this time, the quiet didn't feel oppressive or loaded with unspoken tensions. The house had settled into a different kind of stillness, not the silence of secrets being kept, but the peaceful quiet of a space that was finally honest about what it contained. The kids were still asleep upstairs, and I could hear the gentle sounds of their breathing through the baby monitor I still kept on the kitchen counter from when they were younger. For the first time in months, the sun seemed to actually reach into the kitchen through the windows. The light looked different somehow, cleaner, like it wasn't being filtered through the haze of deception and resentment that had been clouding everything for so long. The house, for all its scars and painful associations, had begun to settle back into being what it was supposed to be. A place where the people who lived there could breathe freely and speak honestly. Later that morning, I knew I'd have to sit the kids down and explain what had happened, though I still wasn't sure how to translate this adult catastrophe into words they could understand. I'd have to tell them that Mommy and Daddy were going to be living in different places now, that we still loved them more than anything in the world, that none of this was their fault. The conversation I'd been dreading for weeks was finally unavoidable, but somehow, in the clear light of that first morning after, it felt manageable. Difficult, heartbreaking, but manageable. Later that morning, I faced the conversation I'd been dreading for weeks. I sat both kids down at the kitchen table, the same table where their mother had once helped them with math homework and cut up apple slices for after-school snacks. The morning light streamed through the windows, making everything look deceptively normal and peaceful, as if we were just having another ordinary family chat instead of delivering news that would reshape their entire understanding of our family. I didn't give them the gory details of affairs and betrayal. They were 7 and 9 years old, far too young to understand the adult complexities of infidelity and broken trust. I didn't use words like affair or cheating, or explain the elaborate web of lies their mother had been weaving for months. Instead, I kept it simple and focused on what would actually affect their daily lives. "I need to tell you something important," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected it to be. "Mom and Dad are going to be living in different places now. We're getting something called a divorce, which means we won't be married anymore, but we'll both still be your parents forever." They were quiet for a long time, processing this information with the kind of serious concentration that only children can manage when they sense something truly significant is happening. Then my daughter, with her 7-year-old directness, asked the question that absolutely shattered me. "Did Mommy leave because of us?" That broke something deep inside my chest. I pulled her close, holding her tighter than I ever had before, and whispered into her hair, "No, sweetheart, not even a little bit. This wasn't about you or your brother. This was about grown-up things that had nothing to do with how much we love you." But even as I said those comforting words, I knew they weren't entirely true. Because in a way, it was about them. Every moment Chloe had snuck out to be with someone else. Every night she'd stayed gone. Every lie she'd told about where she was going. She had been choosing something else over this family. Over them. She had been willing to risk their stability, their sense of security, their trust in the adults who were supposed to protect them, all for the sake of a relationship she'd admitted wasn't even serious. My son, always the more practical of the two, wanted to know about the logistics. Where will Mommy live? When will we see her? Will we still have Christmas together? His questions were matter of fact, but I could see the worry behind his eyes, the fear that his whole world was about to become unpredictable and strange. I answered what I could and promised we'd figure out the rest together. I told them that no matter what happened between their mother and me, they would always be the most important thing in both our lives. I said it with as much conviction as I could muster, even though I wasn't entirely sure Chloe's actions over the past few months supported that claim. 3 days later, she came by to pick them up for her first official visitation. She knocked this time instead of using her key, a small gesture that somehow made the fundamental change in our relationship more real than signing papers ever could. She didn't walk into the house like she owned the space anymore. She waited on the porch like any other visitor would. When she saw the kids, her face softened in that automatic way it always had when she looked at them. Whatever had broken between us, whatever capacity for genuine emotion she'd lost when it came to me, she still had it for them. She hugged them with real warmth, listened to their excited chatter about school and friends with what seemed like genuine interest. And for a moment, it was almost possible to remember the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But when her eyes met mine over their heads, it was all blank glass again. Not guilt, not sorrow, not even acknowledgement of the devastation she'd left in her wake. Just that same vacant expression I'd been seeing for months. Like I was a stranger she'd been briefly introduced to but couldn't quite place. "Thanks," she said when I helped buckle our youngest into her car seat. The word coming out flat and perfunctory, like I was some helpful neighbor instead of the father of her children and the man whose life she'd systematically dismantled. Then she drove off with them, taking them to whatever new life she was building, leaving me standing on the porch for a long time, watching their taillights disappear down the familiar street. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I didn't feel like chasing after her. I didn't feel like breaking down or demanding answers or fighting for something that was already gone. I just breathed, and I let her go. Weeks passed, and with them the rhythm of my life changed in ways both subtle and profound. Not overnight, not all at once, but like the tide creeping in at low water. Quiet, gradual, inevitable. I started doing the laundry without automatically separating out her clothes, without setting aside the delicate items that required special care. The empty space in our bedroom closet stopped bothering me, stopped serving as a daily reminder of what was missing. Instead, it just became space, neutral, available, mine to fill or leave empty as I chose. I found myself cooking for 3 people instead of 4, and the grocery list gradually shrank as I stopped buying her almond milk, her specific brand of Greek yogurt, those overpriced shampoos she'd insisted were essential for her hair type. The bathroom counter stayed clean now, free of the clutter of products I'd never understood the purpose of. Little by little, the house was becoming mine again, settling into patterns that served the people who actually lived there instead of accommodating someone who was only physically present. I learned to enjoy the silence in ways I never had before. Instead of feeling oppressive or loaded with unspoken tensions, the quiet became something I could sink into, something that let the house breathe and settle into its natural rhythms. I could hear the kids laughing upstairs, could focus on their bedtime stories without wondering where their mother was or when she'd come home smelling like someone else's cologne. The children adjusted faster than I'd thought they would, displaying that remarkable resilience that kids seem to possess in situations that would break most adults. They asked fewer questions with each passing week, stopped checking the door, hopefully every time they heard a car in the driveway. They seemed to understand, in that intuitive way children often do, that this new normal was actually more stable than what we'd been living with before. Chloe's phone calls became more spaced out as time went on, and when she did FaceTime with the kids, I noticed she was calling from what looked like a series of different apartments. Always new walls in the background, always temporary-looking furniture, always that slightly rehearsed smile that suggested she was performing happiness rather than actually feeling it. I watched these conversations from the corner of the room, never interrupting, but never completely letting my guard down either, ready to step in if the kids needed support. I didn't ask about him, and she didn't offer any information about her new life. We communicated almost exclusively through emails, now cold, structured, legalistic exchanges about pickup times and dentist appointments and school events. She signed her messages simply Chloe, like we were strangers negotiating the terms of a business arrangement rather than two people who had once promised to build a life together, who had created children together, who had shared a bed and dreams and a mortgage for over a decade. Maybe that's exactly what we were now. Strangers managing the practical details of shared custody. People who had once been intimate, but now needed lawyers to help them communicate effectively. The transformation felt both shocking and oddly inevitable, like we'd been heading toward this formal distance for longer than either of us had been willing to admit. The manila folder full of evidence was still in my desk drawer, untouched since the day she'd left. I hadn't looked at it since then, hadn't felt the need to revisit those screenshots and timestamps and carefully documented lies. Not because I'd forgiven her or because the pain had faded, but because I no longer needed proof of what had happened. The evidence of her betrayal was written into the new shape of our lives, visible in the way my children had learned to pack overnight bags and the way I'd learned to sleep through the night without wondering where she was. One evening, while cleaning out some old boxes in the garage, I found a bottle of her perfume tucked behind the bathroom mirror. The same fragrance she'd worn on our 4th anniversary. The one I'd bought her when she said she wanted to feel expensive and sophisticated. It must have been there for months, forgotten in the chaos of her secret life and hurried departure. I opened it and breathed in the scent once, just once, letting myself remember what it used to mean when that smell greeted me at the end of a long workday. Then I tossed it in the trash without ceremony, without sentiment, without looking back. That was the night I finally took off my wedding ring, slipping it off my finger while brushing my teeth and placing it in the same drawer where hers had once lived. Back when we used to shower together and laugh about who had left wet towels on the bathroom floor. Removing that ring didn't feel like an ending. It felt like space finally being cleared, like removing a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. It felt like the final acknowledgement that the person I'd made those vows to no longer existed, and the person she'd become deserved no such promises or symbols of commitment. Later that same evening, I went outside and sat on the front porch with a cold beer in my hand, something I hadn't done in months. The air was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that cuts through everything superficial and wakes you up from the inside out. I sat there for a long time, just staring up at the stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than I remembered them being. Like the sky had cleared along with everything else in my life. I realized, sitting there in the darkness with only the sound of distant traffic and the occasional dog barking somewhere down the street, that I wasn't waiting for her anymore. Not for an apology that would never come. Not for an explanation that would somehow make sense of the devastation she'd left behind. Not even for some moment of understanding or closure that might help me process what had happened to us. I didn't need closure from the person who had opened the door to our marriage and simply walked away without looking back. Because the truth is, she wasn't coming back. Not physically, not emotionally, not in any way that mattered. And for the first time since discovering her affair, I found that I didn't want her to. The house feels lighter now in ways that have nothing to do with her physical absence and everything to do with the absence of deception. Not empty, mine. There's a crucial difference between those two states that I'm only beginning to understand. The silence no longer chokes or suffocates. Instead, it wraps around me like a worn-in jacket. Something comfortable that fits because it's been lived in. earned through surviving something that could have destroyed me but didn't. This is the kind of quiet you earn after walking through fire and discovering that you didn't come out clean, but you did come out whole. It's the peace that settles over you when you finally stop fighting battles that were lost before they even began. When you realize that sometimes the best thing you can do is simply survive someone else's choices and refuse to let those choices define who you become. Chloe signed the divorce papers without comment or delay, sliding them across the table at the lawyer's office like they were just another piece of paperwork in her busy day, something to be handled efficiently and forgotten. She didn't ask for much in the settlement, maybe guilt, maybe convenience. Maybe she just wanted to close this chapter as quickly as possible so she could focus on writing the next one. I didn't ask her motivations, and I didn't look too closely at her reasons. Her story was continuing elsewhere now, in white-walled apartments with unfamiliar furniture and temporary arrangements. Let it continue without me. Let her build whatever version of happiness she thinks she deserves. Construct whatever narrative helps her sleep at night. Create whatever new life doesn't require her to look me in the eye or explain herself to the children we created together. I was done being a character in her story of self-discovery and personal fulfillment at everyone else's expense. As for me, I started building something different. I repainted the bedroom in colors I actually liked, got rid of that duvet she'd chosen because it matched some vision she'd had of what our life should look like. I replaced her nightstand with a bookshelf filled with novels I'd been meaning to read for years, but never had time for when I was trying to save a marriage that was already over. The closet was half empty now, but it was honestly half empty. No more pretending there was more there than there actually was. The bathroom smells like cedar and mint instead of vanilla and deception. The kitchen has become a place where real conversations happen again, where my children can ask questions without worrying about undercurrents of tension they didn't understand. The house has settled into being a home again rather than a stage where someone was performing a life they didn't really want to live. And the children, they're not just okay, they're better. They laugh more easily now, sleep through the night consistently, hold my hand longer than they used to when we're walking somewhere together. They've stopped asking when mommy is coming home and started asking what we're going to do this weekend, what movie we should watch, whether we can get a dog now that there's more space in our lives for things that bring joy rather than complications. They're healing, and so am I. Not by forgetting what happened or pretending it wasn't as devastating as it was, but by reclaiming our lives from the shadow of someone else's choices. We're learning to be a family again, smaller than before, but more honest, more stable, more genuinely connected than we'd been in the months leading up to the explosion that finally cleared the air. It's not about forgetting what happened or pretending it wasn't as devastating as it was. The betrayal was real, the lies were extensive, and the damage was significant. But healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about reclaiming your life from the shadow of someone else's choices, about refusing to let their decisions define who you become or how you move forward. One night, a few weeks after the final divorce papers had been filed and processed, I found something I'd completely forgotten about. Tucked in the back of a drawer I rarely opened, behind some old bills and warranty information for appliances we'd bought years ago, was an old birthday card she'd written me during what I now realize were probably our last genuinely happy months together. The card itself was simple, nothing elaborate or expensive, but inside she'd written in her careful handwriting, "You're the only place I ever feel safe." I stared at those words for a long time, trying to reconcile them with the person who had systematically dismantled our marriage while I slept in the next room. It was funny, in a way that wasn't funny at all, how people could outgrow even their own truths, how someone could mean something completely when they wrote it, and then act in ways that made those same words seem like they'd been written by a stranger. I read that message once more, letting myself remember what it had felt like to be someone's safe harbor, someone's refuge from whatever storms were raging in the outside world. Then I lit a match and watched the edges of the card curl and blacken, watched the ink bleed and smear before the words disappeared entirely into flame. Not out of anger or spite, those emotions had long since burned themselves out, but simply for closure. The kind of closure she'd never given me, but that I could give myself. I stood outside that night in my backyard, barefoot on the cold grass, watching the ashes drift upward like dust from a memory that no longer had the power to hurt me. The night air was clean and sharp, and I found myself thinking about those 5 words she'd said that had started all of this. Let's talk tonight. Night after night, I had waited for that conversation, had prepared myself for honesty that never came, had hoped for explanations that were never offered. But tonight had finally come, in all its forms and iterations. And I had done what she never had the courage to do. I had shown up for it. Fully, completely, with all the honesty and vulnerability that real communication requires. I had faced the truth of what our marriage had become, had documented it, had presented it without drama or manipulation, and had accepted the consequences of that truth even when it meant losing everything I'd thought I wanted to protect. She had chosen to disappear rather than deal with the reality of what she'd done. She had chosen secrets over conversations, deception over honesty, escape over the hard work of actually addressing what was broken between us. But I had chosen differently. I had chosen to stay present, to demand truth, to face the devastating reality of our situation head-on, rather than continue living in the comfortable lies she'd constructed around us. The house behind me was quiet now, but it was the right kind of quiet. The peaceful silence of a space where people could sleep soundly, because there were no secrets hiding in the shadows, no lies waiting to be discovered, no elaborate deceptions that required constant maintenance and careful choreography. My children were asleep upstairs in their own beds, in their own rooms, in a home where they could trust that the adults in their lives would be honest with them and with each other. This wasn't the life I'd planned or the ending I'd hoped for when I'd stood at an altar 11 years ago and promised to love someone through whatever challenges life might bring us. But it was honest, and it was mine, and it was built on a foundation of truth rather than convenience. It was a life where I could look at myself in the mirror without wondering what I was missing, without questioning my own instincts, without feeling like I was slowly going crazy from living in someone else's carefully constructed version of reality. The match burned down to my fingers and I dropped it, watching the tiny flame go out against the damp grass. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments, new moments of learning how to be a single parent and a divorced man in a world that still sometimes felt foreign to me. But tonight, standing in my own backyard under stars that seemed impossibly bright and clear, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of resolution or happy endings, but the deeper peace that comes from finally telling the truth and discovering that you can survive it. The peace of knowing that whatever comes next, you'll face it with your eyes open and your integrity intact. The peace of understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go, especially when letting go, means admitting that the person you loved was never really there in the first place.